1898 saw the publication of one of the most influential sci-fi stories of all time, War of the World, perhaps depicting the first rendition of an alien spacecraft, the three-legged war machines. Within the following century, in a ton of TV shows and movies, would see stories focusing upon aliens with their advanced technology coming to Earth either for peaceful reasons or for malicious intentions. But none of these representations on films would ever see any of the alien technology to be resemblant of that to the War of the World's tripods. Instead, they would favour flying saucers for the alien spacecraft. Not even in the actual adaptation of War of the World, made back in the 1950s, would favour the flying saucer design instead and not the three-legged tripod look seen in the illustrations of the book. There were plans and proposals on how to depict the alien tripods by using a marionette puppet, but it wasn't cost efficient at the time. On the big screen, it wouldn't be until about 85 years later of the book's original publication where technology was finally advanced enough to represent a multi-legged war machine in the original Star Wars trilogy. The name of this intergalactic war weapon was dubbed by the evil Galactic Empire, and most Star Wars nerds, the AT-ST, or its nickname back during the original film's production was the Chicken Walker. The Chicken Walker has an uncanny resemblance to the War of the World vehicles, with its transportation being done by legs, and having somewhat of a visible face in its design. If indeed the design of the Chicken Walker was supposed to pay tribute to the War of the World book, or was just somewhat of a big coincidence, other people as well as myself can't help but draw the connection. It's still greatly an intimidating design. With Star Wars having a futuristic look, what's the best way to upgrade from tanks and caterpillar tracks? Actually have a vehicle that can squish the enemy. As a young lad, being fascinated with the War of the World story and getting into the Star Wars films, I couldn't help but grin with excitement at the Chicken Walker and desperately wanted a toy of it. But alas, there was just no toys like it in my neighbourhood. Until over a decade later, being old enough for my own money and a short trip to Forbidden Planet, I finally got one. Being a part of the Black Series line, this figurine is actually a re-release from over a decade ago, with this particular sculpt first being seen in the Collector Legacy line. But at least in terms of figures within the 3.75 inch scale, this is only the second cast mould to ever be made of the AT-ST. Following on from the 80s and 90s, it was the same vintage figure casting moulds that they use for the AT-ST every time they re-released that toy. First being released as the Empire Strikes Back vintage line, as it did make a small cameo appearance in that film, but then having a far more bigger role in Return of the Jedi. The original vintage toy had a button on the back that would move the legs, giving a simulation of it walking. Admittedly, I wanted to get the vintage one over the modern one that was released when I was a kid. I'll explain why later on. In the countless cartoons and Star Wars movies that were released afterwards, there would be many vehicles that would take a loose influence on the AT-ST. It wouldn't be until about 33 years later, after the release of Return of the Jedi, that we would finally get a reappearance of the Chicken Walker itself in Rogue One, making a small cameo appearance. Alright, that will do it for the context. Let's actually open up this toy. It comes with a removable laser cannon that you can place in with one that can be played with. It's big and bulky, but still fits in quite nice with the figure. I'm not too fussed about the play feature, so I'll probably stick with the other one. It also comes with a pilot figure that you can remove the helmet, and also has its own blaster. The figure has a nice range of articulation, as all of these modern Star Wars figures. He's got ball joints in his head, his waist, his arms, elbows, and feet. His wrist can rotate, and his legs can shift in and out. So quite a bit for a figure that's only supposed to be stationary within the vehicle. And with the actual vehicle, there's a hatch that you can actually lift up and put the pilot in. So the figure can be displayed alongside the Chicken Walker. And the Chicken Walker itself is a pretty damn good vehicle, looking pretty spot on to what was in the film, having the appropriate range of articulation. The cannon doesn't shrivel that much and doesn't really point up any higher, but then it was mainly aimed to the ground in the movies. While it does have the articulation to be a pretty poseable figure, it's really hard to get it into an action pose. And even if you do, over a period of time on the shelf, it will inevitably fall down. I have already had it a couple of times falling onto the floor. and some of the laser cannons that it has on the side of its head, I'm worried that someday the figure will fall down and those bits will snap off. In the original Star Wars trilogy, the effect of bringing the AT-ST to life had to be done through stop motion. The original stop motion model had to be held on a stand as it couldn't hold its own weight. Maybe this should have been something that could have been introduced with this set, a stand, so on display if you wanted a bit more of an action-packed pose rather than the stationary pose for your AT-ST, then you could have done so with the aid of the stand. Kids, I can imagine, having a much more frustrating time to play with this figure, as he'll probably keep on falling over during playtime. What I liked about the original version was that it was already sculpted in a stationary pose, with the added feature of the walking legs. This one I would imagine that I would have preferred being a kid, as it would have been ready on the go. Now don't get me wrong, this figure I still really like. I'm just suggesting what a kid might prefer, and for me, a stand would have been useful. For the type of stuff I do, toy photography, the figures just stand long enough for me to take my pictures. The first photo session I did with the figure was nearby some fields near my house. It was a challenge since the ground wasn't flat. The photograph of the vehicle was mainly submerged in the background, with the figures in the forefront. I used some of the 5-inch figurines, and just try to set it up at the right angle so you couldn't tell that the AT-ST was only just another figure higher than the troopers, and just adding a touch of a colour grade to make it seem more moody and more like a war zone. Boba Fett didn't stand out too well from the green grass. I did try adding in the sky in the background just to make him stand out a little bit more. I had also brought along some of my smaller figures so they could fit in scale with the AT-ST. After that time photographing in that field and taking a look at the pictures, I didn't feel like that the figurines really stood in that well with the scaling of the grass. I had a second attempt to photograph the AT-ST on a Welsh beach called Merlot Sands, being famous for its Silurian rocks. I initially went there to make a documentary in that subject, but I brought my Star Wars toys along just in case if I had any time left within the day, as I figured that it would be a great stand-in for Tatooine. Well, I got all my lines done and I had enough time to do that photo shoot. Just a minor colour grade was needed just to get those colours just a little bit more warmer, and also just masking around the AT-ST and just bringing the colours back down a bit to make it look more like a war machine, rather than looking bright and yellow. This picture, the trooper on the right, I felt like that his face was too out of focus, so I used a close-up shot and mask around that picture and swapped that in for his face. Then I colour graded the picture, felt like that the orange bandanas were a bit too bright, so I masked around those specific ones and just toned down the colours. This photograph, I felt there was too much visibility of the sky and floor, so I zoomed in a little bit, and then using the surrounding images to fill up the gaps to make it a wide picture. The solo shot of this trooper, I felt that there could have been something in the sky, so after some slight colouring tinkering, I blue screened the sky out and inserted in some green screen shots I had of the AT-ST models. And since they were in the background, I just ever so slightly blurred them out to appear out of focus. This day of shooting with the chicken walker was far more successful than the other day in the field. If there was an uneven ground and the chicken walker started to wobble, I could just put a few rocks under its feet and hey presto, we're ready to go again. And also, going on that Silurian beach, the setting was just so much more fitting and appropriate for the Star Wars toys. Overall, I still really love the chicken walker, and I'll probably be using this toy more often for my photo shoots. Yes, it's a pain getting it to stand up, but it's just worth it just to have it within the shots, as it helps the troops just feel a little bit more bigger in scale. To make this video come full circle from where we left off, here's a couple of pictures of London that I took many years ago with my AT-ST inserted into them, just as a bit of creative visual fun, and give that War of the World feel. If you'd like to see more images like this, and also keep up to date about upcoming projects I'm doing, then please follow me on social media. And also, if you'd like to see more videos like this, then subscribing to my YouTube account would be very much appreciated. And if you'd like to see other kind of videos I make on YouTube, then here's a couple of video links you can click on right now.